Good afternoon and welcome to this special CNAS event on Afghanistan. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. The immediate item for discussion today is the substance of a new report by Lisa Curtis, director of our Indo-Pacific Security Program, on dealing with a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, supporting the Afghan people without legitimizing the regime. And the broader context is well known. After 20 years of fighting to prevent Taliban rule in Afghanistan, the fundamentalist Islamist movement is back in power after the withdrawal of American forces from the country. And as much as there may be a temptation in some quarters to imagine that we can simply turn the page on Afghanistan, events there continue to demand U.S. attention. Threats from both al-Qaeda and ISIS are taking on a new dimension without an American military presence in the country. The rights and freedoms of Afghan women and girls and of civil society organizations requires protections. Individuals, including those who worked with international forces during the 20-year war, are still endeavoring to leave the country safely. And a dire humanitarian situation has emerged as average Afghans struggle to meet their basic needs for food and shelter and access to healthcare. So this all poses a series of conundrums: how to deal with terrorist threats inside Afghanistan without a presence there. What leverage do we have to press the Taliban on human rights, including the rights of women and girls? Should the U.S. and other donor countries provide humanitarian assistance to relieve the ongoing crisis, or does this simply strengthen and legitimize the Taliban? So to discuss all this, we have two portions to today's conversation. First up, we'll have Congressman Mike Waltz, and I will introduce him in just a moment. Then after his remarks, we'll have an expert panel with Fawzia Koofi, former Deputy Speaker of the Afghan Parliament, Matin Bek, former Chief of Staff to President Ashraf Ghani, Lisa Curtis from CNAS, and it'll be moderated by CNAS Adjunct Senior Fellow Ambassador Kelley Currie. But first up, Congressman Mike Waltz. He has in-depth knowledge of and experience in Afghanistan. He served there as a Green Beret. He worked on the issue for Vice President Cheney during the George W. Bush administration. And while in Congress, he's been instrumental in helping private veterans' efforts to evacuate Afghan security forces safely from the country. He's also called on the State Department to expand its current visa categories for vulnerable Afghans, and has championed legislation to allow Afghans enlisted in the U.S. military to get a pathway to U.S. citizenship. So he'll kick off this discussion with some opening remarks, and then I've got some questions to pose to him, and we'll take some from the audience as well. So if you have questions you want to put in the Q&A box, we'll try to get to those. But first of all, welcome, Congressman Waltz. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to your observations on the state of Afghanistan right now.
Great. Thank you, Richard. I assume you can hear me okay?
We can hear you great.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much to you. Thanks to CNAS, and thank you, Lisa, for your just years of work, both in and out of government, to continue to help the Afghan people, to continue to keep the future of Afghanistan aligned with our interests. I'll just dive right in and try to stay relatively brief, Richard. I've been pretty bluntly outspoken that I thought the withdrawal strategy and the notion of the complete withdrawal itself was an unmitigated disaster. The ramifications, which I don't think we still fully know, and I don't know that will be appreciated for some time to come, but it was certainly a humanitarian disaster for the Afghan people. That is ongoing, unfolding in a tragic way over the winter. It was a disaster from a security standpoint, and I think some fantastical assumptions were made about the capabilities of the Afghan security forces and their ability to continue to fight on when we withdrew our intelligence support, our logistics support, our air support, our maintenance support, all at once in the middle of a fighting season after the Taliban had been building their position of advantage in the prior year since the signing of the Doha Accords. So from a humanitarian standpoint, disaster; from a security standpoint, a disaster for American credibility around the world. Don't take that from me, and I don't think that's a partisan statement. It's actually been very bipartisan in concern and outrage at what occurred and how it occurred. But take it from Russian state media, North Korean state media, Iranian media, and Chinese state media as they use the propaganda value of America seemingly and frankly, walking away from a 20-year effort and a key ally and a constitutional democracy, as imperfect as it may have been, to walk away from that. They're using it now in their propaganda against Ukraine, against our Gulf allies in Israel, and against Taiwan and against South Korea. And then I think the thing that's so frustrating for me, with a special operations background, and now I'm taking over as the ranking Republican on the military readiness subcommittee on armed forces in the House, is that future American soldiers, one way or another, are going to have to deal with this. Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Haqqani network didn't get the memo that, and I don't mean to sound flippant, but it's incredibly frustrating that this notion that we just end the war on terror because we're tired of how long we've had to be there. We've made a number of mistakes, many mistakes. I wrote a whole book on it years ago on things that we could have and should have done better in both the Bush and the Obama administrations. However, as long as that terrorist threat exists, and it still does, the intelligence as of a week ago that I've received is very clear that Al-Qaeda and ISIS still fully intend to attack our interests around the world and the homeland if given the opportunity, and are developing the capabilities to do so. So I would have hoped that we, as a national security community, would have learned the lessons from the full withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. 3 years later, we had an ISIS caliphate the size of Indiana that nearly overtook the government in Baghdad and launched attacks and mayhem all over the Middle East, Europe, and inspired attacks in the United States. However, when we had to reverse that policy and go back to deal with it, we had bases in Jordan, in northern Iraq, in Turkey, in Israel, in Gulf states. We had allies still on the ground in the Kurds. And we had a whole other kind of toolbox of things that we could use to deal with what became that terrorist caliphate. And over in Afghanistan, we have none of those things. And so this notion that over the horizon counterterrorism, I've looked through my military doctrine books and a number of policy papers, and that term seems to have been invented just in the last year. Unfortunately, it didn't stop the rise of ISIS in Iraq, the morphing from Al-Qaeda into ISIS, despite all of those things in our favor, the basing the local allies, the government in Baghdad. And I don't believe it's going to stop their reemergence again in Afghanistan, where we have none of those things. So to kind of sell the American people that we're just as safe with a long-range drone-only strategy is irresponsible at best, and it's dangerous. And future special operators and intelligence professionals and others are going to have to clean it up, and I fear at great cost. So that is something that, from an oversight standpoint in Congress, I will be keen on. In between that period in Iraq, using it as an analogy, we had a number of analysts and people watching closely that were ringing the alarm bells, that were banging the drums and raising the red flags at what was happening. And we're already starting to see that now with those watching the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. And then just finally, I just want to say thank you for doing this report. To say, I think we are now all in a conundrum of how to help 3/4 of the population of Afghanistan that's literally starving, when just 6 months ago, again, imperfect, but at least living under a democracy with some modicum of hope for a better future. how do we help them without helping the Taliban? I think this report lays out some good recommendations. But at the end of the day, I can, as a taxpayer, as a steward of the taxpayers' dollars, continue to condone hundreds of millions in aid that's going in ways we can't. I mean, right now we can't get a clear plan from USAID or from the State Department of how that aid is actually being distributed without these terrorist organizations taking tens of millions off the top, and without them using it to then pick winners and losers. And I think that's the last thing that we would all want. I think with that, I'll stop, Richard, and open up for any questions that you have or that folks in the audience have. Thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you for your comments, and I want to touch on the variety of things you talked about on the terrorism threat and some other things. But maybe I'll start where you finished on the humanitarian situation, what to be done about it. I mean, as you sort of intimated, most of the international assistance went away after the Taliban took over, and the funds that were being spent in the country by foreign groups has dried up. So you've got a food shortage, a liquidity crisis, a deepening kind of desperation among Afghans. In September, the U.S. World Food Program estimated that 14 million Afghans faced crisis-level hunger. They've updated that to 22 million now. So this is a pretty big crisis there. The U.S. has announced a $300 million package, which you just alluded to. What do you think we should do, if anything, in terms of assistance inside Afghanistan?
Well, I could tell you just from my time on the ground that the Taliban and particularly the Haqqani network perfected the mafia style kind of taking from the top, and funded themselves to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars over the years. And I have no reason to doubt that they will continue to do the same with these dollars, particularly now that they have to govern. And the most frustrating part was to watch them use the aid, literally oftentimes with the gun to the head of the aid groups who were trying to just do the best that they could, but were often subcontracted again, either directly through USAID or through the UN humanitarian assistance programs. But once they got out on the ground and it came time to actually distribute it, they were literally often at gunpoint to hand portions of it over to. I mean, we see this in Africa, we see it at other places, but I have to tell you, the scale that we saw the Haqqanis and the Taliban doing it was incredibly disturbing. And that's when we had forces on the ground, and we had USAID and State Department and other officers, at least in Kabul and in Kandahar and Herat and Mazar-e Sharif, to provide some level of oversight. Now we have none of that. So what do we do? I think that's the $64 million question. I would like to see some third-party banks, some independent banks that some of these reserve currency dollars can go to at least keep some of the basic government services functioning. I think there's a lot more we could do with blockchain and with other types of more innovative approaches than the typical, contract to subcontract, and then hope, pennies on the dollar actually get to starving Afghans. I'd like to see some of the Central Asian states more engaged. And there are pockets that I think we can and should be working with more directly, namely the Hazaras and Hazarajat and some of the Tajiks in the north, whether that's with Ahmed Massoud's folks, whether that's Saleh's folks. But that's going to, I think that's going to dance the administration on some difficult lines that I don't think they're prepared to do. I really get the sense, and I don't mean this to sound partisan in any way. There are many on the other side of the aisle in Congress who feel the same way, that the administration really kind of wants to turn the page here. and move on to other priorities. I could tell you, and I want to tell every Afghan and every veteran, everybody who's been given so much of themselves to this effort to protect the homeland over the years, I'm not going to let it go. I'm not going to give up. So many of these veterans, grassroots organizations aren't going to give up. And again, I'm really thrilled to see CNAS spending time on this to try to provide some real policy solutions. And thanks for the report.
Yeah, maybe I could just pick up on that last comment you made, because if we do turn the page or at least try to, it won't be the first time. We've tried to do that in Afghanistan, as any student of history knows. And you've been involved in things going on in Afghanistan for quite a long time. I mean, maybe you could just share for a minute your thoughts on the lessons of history, but with respect to Afghanistan, but also when it comes to what America should care about. I mean, what's really at stake here when you're talking to your constituents and they say, why the hell should we care about what's happening in Afghanistan? We're not there anymore. There's problems all over the world. We've got problems here. You know, what are we so animated about this? What's the answer to that question?
Well, I think it just cuts against the grain of most Americans. The notion of leaving our fellow citizens behind, the notion of abandoning our allies. There were so many people over the years who stood with us, not just at risk to themselves, but at risk to their entire families. Anybody who served there knows that the Taliban, if they can't get at you, then they start going after brothers and cousins and family members. And so for so many to have stood with us in line with our values, in line with a future that is free markets and equal rights, free speech, just an open press, again, a flawed, but at least at a basic level, a constitution and a democratically elected government. Americans understand that at a very visceral level, and that the United States of America has to stand with our allies. We live up to our commitments, and that we are the leader of the free world. And if not for us, then who? So I think there is absolutely a level of frustration. 20 years is too long. We've spent so much, but when you walk people through and you remind them the 70 years that we've been engaged in Europe, the 50,000 troops we still have in Japan, the 30,000 in South Korea, heck, the fact that we've had small groups of special forces in Colombia for 40 years. And when you put it in the context of really this is then a debate about American leadership. But I think, Richard, at your base level of why do we care purely in American interest, is the terrorism threat hasn't gone away. And it fully intends to strike us again. Pulse nightclub is right on the edge of my congressional district and was very real to my constituents. And I, for one, don't want to wait for just like what happened in Iraq, and you remind folks of that, and the explosion of ISIS, that San Bernardino, Pulse nightclub, or God forbid another 9/11. And we, in order to contain that threat, we can do it with a very small commitment. I kind of equate it to paying an insurance premium. You pay a little bit every month to prevent that catastrophic event. And I think that's what we should have done, and eventually what we're going to have to do. But how we put Humpty Dumpty back together again is going to be a real challenge. How we gain any level of trust is going to be a real challenge. And going back over there to deal with it if there is another attack, or even the intelligence shows the growing threat of one, it isn't clear. We demanded a plan for what this over-the-horizon counterterrorism looks like in the last defense bill. The administration, I believe it's 90 days after the passage of the bill. So one would argue that we should have had that plan in place before we made the withdrawal decision, because, again, we have no Bagram Air Base and no base in any country neighboring Afghanistan. And then not to mention, we haven't even talked about the great power aspect of this, that Bagram Air Base was the only base in the world sandwiched between China, Russia, and Iran. So there were some other geopolitical aspects to this too. I just think it was a fantastic mistake, and I'm not sure the path to get back to a sustainable place.
Yeah, let me follow up on 2 points. So one, ISIS and Al Qaeda are both present in Afghanistan. One of the things that at least seemed to be one of the narratives last summer is we don't have to worry about ISIS that much because the Taliban and ISIS are enemies and they'll probably fight each other to a draw.
Yeah.
It seems to me kind of a heroic assumption, but that's an editorial comment that you can feel free to disagree with if you'd like. But so one is, should we worry both about ISIS and Al Qaeda, or is this really Al Qaeda or something different?
Yeah.
And then the other question is, given where we are now, is there any alternative to an over the horizon approach to dealing with terrorist threats? Right now, we got to fly up from the Gulf. Maybe at some point we'll have Central Asian base access. We don't now. But is there? What's the alternative now, given where we are?
Well, let me start with the first question. This notion of we can work with good terrorists against the bad terrorists, is essentially what was trying to be peddled, and it fell on its face in the Kabul evacuation with an ISIS suicide bomber that was led out of Bagram prison by the Taliban just 2 weeks prior, and we now have 13 Gold Star families as a result of it. And I think the botched drone strike shows the fantastic difficulties with using long-range drones without other corroborating intelligence. As someone that's personally had to call in more airstrikes and drone strikes than I care to think about at night, we always had corresponding intelligence, whether that was SIGINT or whether that was human on the ground, somebody that actually got eyes on and said, yes, this is who we think it is. And now we've lost that capability. But back to the ISIS piece of that. Well, the UN is already saying that ISIS is spreading throughout the country, outside of its strongholds in Kabul and Nangarhar and Achin district. And the UN's also saying, estimating 10 to 15,000 foreign fighters migrating over into Afghanistan and Western Pakistan. I mean, we can't overstate, I don't think, the symbolic victory here. And as I had a longtime allied ambassador say to me that the message across South Asia and the Middle East was jihad is won, democracy is lost, and the Taliban are the new superheroes on the jihadist bloc that defeated an American, NATO-backed Afghan army and 42 Western nations over a period of 20 years. That has served as a clarion call for many of these groups, and we can't confuse local power struggles, whether they're over smuggling rights or trade routes or local positioning, for the broader issue of waging jihad against the West. I can easily foresee kind of a local power struggles, but coming together, or certainly I don't see the Taliban getting in either Al Qaeda or ISIS's way if they begin plotting and planning to attack the West again. And Al Qaeda is a much worse situation. A massive body of reporting, open source and classified, on the Haqqani network really being the intermediary between Al Qaeda, between Lashkar-e-Taiba, and the Taliban. And now we have the Haqqani in senior positions in the Afghan government, and what just yesterday, Anas Haqqani negotiating in Oslo, Norway, and it's just really fantastical. So, from my perspective, I sent a pretty sternly worded note along with Senator Graham and some others to the administration, but also to the UN. There was a move afoot there, backed by both Pakistan and the Chinese, to hand that UN seat over to the Taliban. I think there's a broader move to release the $9 billion in reserves, and I know that's a horrible situation, but I don't for a second think that those dollars will stop at the Taliban and not flow through the Haqqani over to Al Qaeda. And I think the country that needs to be most nervous in the near term is India. and seeing those arms and ammunition and those resources showing up in the Kashmir, I think that's the first place that we're going to see the ramifications of this disaster.
There's a question.
By the way, I'm sorry, just one more, Richard, on the over-the-horizon counterterrorism.
Yeah, that's right.
Completely dependent on Pakistan for overflight. I mean, that is like, the fire department having to ask permission of the arsonist to allow the fire trucks to get in to put in the fire. I don't see that as sustainable at all, particularly the first time we actually have a lethal strike. That Pakistan objects to, or that Taliban then, that Kabul then objects to Islamabad, objects to Washington, D.C. So I just don't see that as sustainable at all. That really leaves the northern stands, and the rapidly deteriorating situation with Russia doesn't lend itself to Russian acquiescence to have us having a presence there. So again, all of this should have been worked through before making a total withdrawal decision. And now we're in a just a phenomenally difficult situation.
There's a question from the audience. This is from Doug. He says, many Afghans are women leaders or journalists not covered by the SIV program, which is a priority for evacuations. How would you suggest immigration policies for at-risk Afghans be improved? And I know this is something you've worked a huge amount on.
Yeah, it's something that we've worked on and will continue to work on. We were able to get through the Allies Act, the P1, P2 program and then to extend that. So if any of those journalists or women leaders or civil society leaders worked for a program funded by the United States, for example, by the National Endowment of Democracy, then they should qualify for that P1, P2 program. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because the program then requires you to go to a third country to get across, a very dangerous journey across the borders. And frankly, the level of frustration and disgust with many of these groups that are doing everything they can to help those who have stood along with us and with the State Department is just through the roof. Right now, all of the groups that I'm helping are telling me that the State Department is really only approving American citizens, legal permanent residents, and green card holders, and to a much, much smaller extent, some SIV holders that have received the full chief of mission approval. The catch-22 there is it's gone from slow to a snail's pace in terms of processing those applications. So, every day I wake up to, more videos, more cries and pleas of those that are being hunted down or harassed or out of work or literally starving. And it breaks my heart on a daily basis. We're going to continue. My push in the very near term is for the State Department to extend that P1, P2 status to the Afghan commandos and special forces and others that were also supported through U.S. funding. That is a policy change the State Department could make tomorrow and should make. Those are some of the groups that are being most actively hunted down right now as we speak, sadly using our own data, for example, the payroll data that was left behind and shouldn't have been. So we're working to help then, but then there's also on the resettlement side, some of these former military want to join the U.S. military, and I'll be introducing a measure in the next defense bill that if they sign up to serve yet again, I mean, God bless them, in the United States military, many of them, for example, Afghan pilots and other specialty skills, that they should have an accelerated pathway to citizenship. The problem now with the folks that we've gotten out is once their humanitarian parole expires in 2 years, they'll be in a real gray area from an immigration standpoint. Basically, they'll be kind of at the bottom of the pile of our asylum system, which is completely broken. And right now is a 5 to 7 year backlog to get through the court system. There's a separate push. I'm a co-sponsor, but but not the leading member, to give them an accelerated pathway as well and get them out of that asylum process. So those are just a couple of efforts that are underway right now.
That's great. Let me just follow up though so there's several problems that you outlined, and behind all this, I think, is the bracing reality that may not be obvious to people who don't sort of follow what's happening in Afghanistan every day, that the evacuation is not over. It's not on the front pages anymore.
Right.
The dramatic side of the evacuation is not over. But in terms of the people who we would like as Americans to help get out, or that are eligible to get out, or arguably should be eligible to get out, we still have quite a large number of people that are in some peril there, well beyond the humanitarian crisis that is sweeping up all Afghans. So you were talking about how, okay, you could extend categories of eligibility in certain ways, but one of these real sticking points is the resources available to process this. I mean, it kind of is unfathomable when you step back from it all, if this really is a national priority, that it's going to take years to process P1 and P2 visas. I mean, it seems like there has to be a solution for the country that put a man on the moon and that invented the atomic bomb and the internet and all of these things that we're able to do, but we can't any quicker process visas because we just don't have enough people. I mean,
well, we could.
Am I wrong?
We could. I mean, it's just not a priority. And again, that is just, it just pains my soul. It's just wrong on so many levels, but they could be processed faster. They should be processed faster. And look, we throw a lot of resources at a lot of things. I mean, we're not even talking billions on Capitol Hill now. Now we're, it's the new normal to talk trillions at a problem. But I think for a relatively small investment, we could accelerate this problem. There is a belief and notion that no matter what we throw at it, there will always be more Afghans that want to come. And there will always be more that are constantly applying, and we'll just never be able to, I think what goes unsaid is the administration saying they'll never be able to turn the page. That's no excuse then to do, next to nothing. And look, I know a lot of great civil servants and military members and others are doing the best they can, but you hit the nail on the head. If we wanted to make this a priority, we could. And we should, and there's certainly bipartisan support in the Congress. So you can't blame can't blame politics on this one. I think the veterans in particular have stood up on both sides of the aisle and put our differences aside on other issues. Starting in April, as soon as the announcement was made, we started demanding that they had to begin the evacuation then. And if you go back in history, if you look at what President Ford did in South Vietnam, he put executive orders in place. He approached the Hill and got the legislation. He told all of his agencies that this was absolutely a priority. They got Guam there as a massive lily pad. I mean, and we did it. And certainly we didn't get everyone out, but we got the right people out, and we got, we lived up to our moral obligation to stand with our allies that had stood with us. And we just have not seen that level of direction and forcefulness from this White House for reasons that I still can't explain.
All right, Congressman, we promised we'd let you get back to the people's work. Thank you for joining us and talking Afghanistan with us. And we'll continue on with our next segment here in a moment, but we're grateful for your time and for your comments today.
Well, thank you. And I wish I could stay for Ambassador Currie. She's been a real hero, and so many others. And listen, just for everybody listening, for the veterans groups, for everybody so invested in this and the Afghans, just know that that you have an open door and an open phone line to me. This is, as long as I am in this seat, again, we'll not let this go. We will, I think, eventually get to some level of accountability for how some of these decisions were made. And I mean that to sound as bipartisan as it can. I was very public in my disagreements with things that led up to the Doha agreement. And you've got an ally and a friend here. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Mike. All right. Appreciate it very much. And speaking of Ambassador Currie, it is to Kelley Currie that I'm going to turn for our next conversation. Kelley is an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS. She served as ambassador at large for global women's issues, and she's been very, very active in the effort to evacuate Afghans under threat in this new political era. So, Kelley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate it, and it's wonderful to be with you and to have been able to listen to you and Congressman Waltz, my good friend Mike Waltz, talk about the work that he and his staff have been doing. I have to say right back at you, and especially give a shout out to Kelsey on his staff, who we couldn't have done anything that we were doing without her and her network and the incredible around the clock effort that so many congressional staffers, veterans, and others who really pitch in during the NEO and have continued to stick with this since August 31st, and who I continue to talk to every day and every week and work with and keep in touch with. So I greatly appreciate everything and his incredible leadership on this from a very personal place, but also as an American, very proud to have leaders like Mike Waltz in the Congress who are holding us to account for our values. It's also a real honor as an adjunct fellow at CNAS to participate in this briefing today with my great colleagues, Lisa Curtis and to introduce Lisa, who is the senior fellow and the director. I'm going to get this wrong, Lisa, so correct me if I do. The senior fellow and director of the Asia programs at CNAS, and was my great colleague in the administration, working when she was working at the National Security Council, and we worked together on Afghanistan and at that time. And also with my very dear friend, Fawzia Koofi, who, speaking of people that I was on the phone with during the entire evacuation, Fawzia is one of those who it's a pleasure to see her face coming through to me this afternoon, and to be on this panel with her and have an opportunity to hear from such an incredible leader who has done so much, not just for Afghan women, but for all the Afghan people, to set a standard of leadership, to really to demonstrate what it means to be a true patriot in Afghanistan, and to, again, hold everybody to account, not just her own government, her own Afghan government, the Taliban, but our government as well. And so it's just an incredible honor. And then to have Matin Bek, who is the former chief of staff to President Ghani, and was like Fawzia John, a member of the negotiating team in Doha, and has served in various government positions and knows very intimately the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and what it has been like for during his time in government service. And so we have a wonderful panel to discuss this great report that Lisa organized and was the author of, and I was pleased to be able to contribute a little bit to the work that she did on this great report. And I encourage everyone to go out and read it if you haven't done so already. It's not very long, but it is very meaty and has some great recommendations and thoughtful things to say about how we should be carrying out U.S. policy going forward. So with that, I think I'll start it off by kind of asking everybody a question to kind of bounce off of. and see if we heard from Congressman Waltz about the humanitarian situation, about the continuing struggles with the evacuation. If from your perspective, what should the priority be? We've got a lot of competing priorities with counterterrorism and with the evacuation still ongoing, including American citizens still stuck in Afghanistan, and various humanitarian crises ongoing. What should the U.S. priority be with regard to Afghanistan right now and then how should we, in your view, really think about approaching the situation to work on those priorities?
Kelley, who would you like to start?
Okay. With Fawzia, John, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kelley, a good friend for many people in Afghanistan. You talked about the evacuation. I am sure you still continue to be on the phone with many people. Lisa, thank you so much for producing this timely report at this important times. It's great to be sharing the same panel with my former colleague and friend, Bek Saib. And Mike was so wonderful. We owe him so much for what he does to the people of Afghanistan and continue to do, not only post 15th of August, but for his service in Afghanistan, for a good representation of Afghanistan. This report comes at a very critical time. The issue of humanitarian crisis and humanitarian aid is a very rather sensitive issue because on one hand you have a 35 or more or less population who are in the age of hunger. Economic situation is getting dire. The economy is in the edge of collapse. You have millions of people who have not been paid for months, especially the women who have been breadwinners of their family, who lost their husbands, their male members of the family in the war. They were the supporter of their children, and they are in contact with us on daily basis, needing food and basic necessity of life. On the other hand, we know that in many post-conflict countries, including in Syria, Palestine, even Yemen, the humanitarian aid actually has emboldened and empowered the local authorities, in this case, the de facto authority of Taliban. So it is a very sensitive issue. But as a human rights activist and somebody who have had the pleasure of representing people, I would like to sometimes close my eyes when I see even Taliban are standing on the bags of food and aid, trying to distribute them to their own supporters and people. I want that aid to still continue to go to the people of Afghanistan because I know that it's the people who are carrying the main burden of all of this, and especially when it comes women and children. UNICEF report today says 1 million children are at risk of losing their life. So I hope the world will really agree on a mechanism to ensure that there is transparency, that there is accountability, that the aid actually reach the unreached people of Afghanistan, because ultimately they will be the one who will be suffering. I know that not only this will lead to more poverty, but rather encourage a lot of those families, the main, to join other military extremist groups in the region. So yes, it's a difficult question, but we also know that that without the humanitarian aid, the country is going to become the situation will deteriorate. But Ambassador Kelley, the situation right now in Afghanistan look like if you really beat a child to death, and when the child starts crying and screaming, you give her a sweet or something to eat. That's how our situation look like. Our people have been really pushed to the corner from many fronts because of the wrong deeds of our leaders and the world leaders, I would say. And now we are kind of being given one bag of wheat and flour and flour and food to keep silent. I think our needs are beyond just humanitarian assistance. I think it's the time for the world to really look at the whole political crisis in Afghanistan and see how we can all come together in the face of unity to deliver to the people of Afghanistan beyond humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, Fawzia John, as always, for that very clear and strong message. And I want to turn to Bek Sahib and hear from him on basically the same question.
Thank you, Ambassador Kelley Currie, for having me here. And thank you, Liza, for the timely report. And good to see you, Koofi Saib, once again, after such a long time. I echo basically what Koofi Saib said, but beside that, I would focus on certain point where Liza has touched upon in the report and recommendation. Beside the humanitarian crisis, which is unfortunately, the way which has been so far, the international community doesn't have a joint strategy to deal with the Taliban. The bilateral negotiation with the Taliban indirectly kind of emboldening them, which we would see already their invitation to Norway as well. So that has to somehow, we have to learn from the Doha negotiation, on which Fawzia John also will talk, how Taliban are kind of exploiting the division among the international community. That part we have to learn from the Doha. Beside that, as the report has mentioned on the establishing of a human rights monitoring mechanism on a daily basis since 15 August, 5 months have passed, the human rights violation is increasing. The graph is much beyond which is being reported on the media. And some of the reports I have seen, which would be public soon, around 400 former ANSF members beside uprising have been killed. 3 days ago, maybe you have also seen in the report, in Kishindi district in Mazar-e-Sharif in Balkh, 9 armed resistance members, along with the 4 civilian, including children and women and children, in a very inhuman way was killed, which is an indicator of war crime. Beside that, the Taliban literally has established a gender apartheid regime, and all their policies we could see. So the pressing issue, what I would say, is an immediate establishment of human rights violation monitoring mechanism to hold Taliban accountable beside the humanitarian assistance. This is becoming more serious. Beside that, on their suppression or repression of media outlets, censoring media outlets, beside that, the journalists or independent YouTubers or Facebook activists, social media activists, some of that is not reported. I know some of the personal accounts have been arrested individuals through their General Intelligence Department. They call it General Intelligence Directorate of Intelligence, something, GID they call it. That has become one of their brutal tool in suppressing the voices, dissident voices. So I'm more concerned about every day about the human rights violation, which is showing a very extreme graph of violation.
Lisa, can I turn to you now? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kelley Currie, for being here, and also distinguished panelists Matin Bek and Fawzia Koofi. It's an honor to be here speaking. And yeah, I think I agree with both Matin Bek and Fawzia Koofi that the humanitarian situation is the most critical, immediate problem that we face in Afghanistan. And I think there is a way to provide assistance to the Afghan people without legitimizing the Taliban. And I don't think we should make the perfect an enemy of the good. I think that, we can't be so rigid that we allow the Afghan people to suffer at this time. And we need to find creative solutions. We can look at the World Bank reviving the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, turn it into a relief fund. This is a fund that was reaching directly to the community development councils, getting to the local population. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, and there won't be some money that maybe goes to the wrong place, but we need to find a solution that can get liquidity in the system, pay the salaries of the civil servant workers, particularly in healthcare and education. And so I think there are ways to do that. And I really do hope that the U.S. administration does support the World Bank in reviving this trust fund and moving forward with that. Now, let me say, I don't think that releasing the nearly 10 million in frozen assets directly to the Taliban without condition is the answer. That is not necessary. We could not even be sure that the Taliban would be good stewards of that money. So I don't think that is the solution. And we still, as Fawzia Koofi mentioned, face human rights violations, mainly of women. And we need a way to be able to try to shape the way the Taliban treats its population, particularly women. So I think that would be the second priority on the human rights front. And I agree with Matin that there should be some kind of human rights monitoring mechanism. And I think we need to stay in close touch with Afghans who, were able to get out of Afghanistan, people like Matin Bek and Fawzia Koofi, and other Afghan refugees who are still in touch with family. They know what's happening, because what we see is the media is increasingly stifled in Afghanistan. And in order to be able to really know the full story of what's going on, I think it's important for U.S. policymakers to be in direct discussion with the Afghans that are here or in Europe or Turkey or elsewhere. And just quickly, I think that another thing that's important is that the U.S. really examine what went wrong. How, after 20 years of investment of blood and treasure, was the Taliban so easily able to retake power? And I'm delighted that there is an Afghanistan War Commission that was established by the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. But it's important for that not to get politicized. The temptation will be for politicians on both sides to use the examination of Afghanistan over the last 20 years to batter each other. And that would be a mistake. I think all Americans would lose in that case. We really do need to learn from our mistakes. And I also think we don't only examine our Afghanistan policy, we need to examine what happened with Pakistan. How is Pakistan able to serve as a sanctuary for the Taliban for 20 years? How could something like that happen? So these are the things that I think are important. Of course, the evacuations must continue. My report talks about empowering the State Department, giving it authorities, and also holding it accountable to stay engaged, to keep evacuating those Afghans that are eligible to apply for resettlement in the United States. And that also the State Department works more closely with private organizations, people who are using their own time, resources, and money to continue to help Afghans out. They need the U.S. government. The U.S. government can negotiate third country relocations, getting people out, flight patterns. There's a need for the U.S. government to remain engaged. So my hope is that the State Department will start working more closely with these private groups to get those Afghans that are still stranded in Afghanistan to safety.
Thank you, Lisa. So those responses have brought up a whole bunch more questions. that I would love to ask. So I'm going to ask a couple more, but then I'm hoping we can also get some questions from our audience that for these great panelists to unpack some of these issues that they've raised. One thing that I haven't heard very much about in the conversation and about what a plan would look like, a real strategy would look like, is a plan for elections. And it seems like if we are going to return to some form of constitutional rule, if there is any hope for a more peaceful resolution or movement away from the current situation, that some kind of elections likely very heavily monitored or run by an outside organization like the UN or the OSCE would have to take place. And it seems like, you know, there's always an argument about whether you do elections sooner or later. And so I'm really interested to hear if the panelists have any thoughts about elections and when and how those could be done.
Okay.
Feel free to jump in.
Okay, go ahead, Matin.
Thank you, Koofi. I think it's a very critical point you raised, Ambassador Currie. And as Madam Koofi is here, during negotiation in Doha, that was our main red light with the Taliban, red line. The rest we could have agreed and on anything, but the head of government had to come through an election. But unfortunately, they didn't believe, and they didn't believe in election. And second, what we have today as a crisis of this human catastrophe, they are mainly responsible because they knew, they were told about this. If any military victory would have denied that, will take country to a humanitarian crisis. And there's enough evidence about that. But there has been push on that front, money behind the scene during the negotiation. And after that, that's why people give time to the Taliban if they would come up with certain things. But unfortunately, they don't believe in election. On a daily, every day passes, they are consolidating power, and a theological, an authoritarian, a totalitarian, an apartheid, a gender apartheid regime. They're establishing that. And unfortunately, I have lost hope in them. If they will negotiate with Afghan, they won't. They have chosen a strategy of deception. And on a daily basis now, could you speak on that? How they have been silencing the dissenting voices, how they have been arresting women. And it's very shocking. It concerns me how the international community doesn't have a joint strategy. Before coming to Norway, they have arrested young women activists, and they're lying about it. Unfortunately, I don't see a path on that, but that is the only solution, a constitutional order where election will be held. That could be the only solution among the Afghans. But that is not working. Taliban don't believe in that. That's why we're already seeing two forms of resistance against Taliban. One is a civilian lead by women inside Afghanistan. The other one is an armed resistance on a daily basis. It's increasing. And the reason why people are going back to armed resistance is the Taliban's behavior itself, because they, on a daily basis, they're killing the former ANSF, former uprising. So I don't see a peace with the Taliban. Unfortunately, it's very unfortunate.
Thank you, Matin. And Fawzia John, could you take the same question?
Yes, Ambassador Kelley, actually, this question can be also analyzed in a bigger context, in terms of the way forward. How will the next steps shape itself in Afghanistan? I think I must say that I see a lack of cohesive approach and strategy from international community beyond the humanitarian crisis towards the political crisis in Afghanistan. You have a de facto power which is not legitimate nationally, not legitimate internationally, continue to commit atrocity, pave the way for further growth of military extremism. And we must all remember that the victory of Taliban have actually inspired many other jihadi and military extremist groups in the region, beyond the region, that will strive to change, democratically elected governments and legitimate governments to replace them through war and fighting. So we know that there are, consequences to come. Now, what to do in Afghanistan in order to avoid Afghanistan once again being the safe haven for many military extremists? We know that just before the collapse, Matin Bek was the head of the Deputy of Intelligence. He will probably clarify more than 22 intelligence more than 22 military extremist networks actually were operating between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia. Now, Afghanistan being a weak government on many fronts, people becoming unhappy and distance themselves day by day for many reasons, and obvious reasons, of course, from the establishment. That paved the way for the growth and the re-emerge of many military extremist groups. These are the risks. On the other hand, you have power which is basically playing with time, and the fact that the Norway meeting happened without a clear approach on efforts to unite a political opposition, civil society, so that they have a strong voice. We know that there were, representation and they were there, but the voice was not as strong as they should have been in a united approach. So, as a whole, I think there is a lack of political kind of view looking ahead and political vision, I would say, for Afghanistan. Everybody now focuses on humanitarian crisis. The UN is not just a charity organization. I think the UN should really get beyond just donation and charity. I think they have to really engage themselves more in a political dialogue. The UNAMA mandate is going to expire. That's the UN Assistant Mission for Afghanistan in March. I think that organization should become now the next mandate should focus on political dialogue, on reaching out to a political agreement where the basic principles of coexistence are respected. One of that base is elections for people to be part of a process. And then, of course, UNAMA, the other mandate for UNAMA could be monitoring of human rights, because my friends Lisa and Matin Bek have mentioned in the absence of a strong human rights monitoring mechanisms, what we basically refer to as individuals reporting that. And there is no data, and that's why we just hear things that happen in Kabul. We don't hear things that happen in the provinces, in the villages, and even if we don't hear them, we don't rely because we don't think that these are reliable sources. In fact, actually, when these girls were arrested by Taliban, a very prominent comedy writer of Afghanistan commented on his social media saying that I wish these girls were really arrested, because even he didn't believe that they were really arrested that way. So you can imagine how there is that level of mistrust and misinformation, and people decide in vacuum of information. And the next day we all came to this understanding that they are actually these girls are put in intelligence number 40, which Matin Bek was the deputy of the intelligence. He knows this was the investigation department. I, as a chair of Human Rights Committee of Parliament, visited that organization, that place many times, because Taliban were kept there just to see their situation of human rights and ensure that they are just in prison, their human rights are not violated. In the same place now, I'm hearing reports that they keep actually these girls. So there is a lack of vision for a political dialogue, I think, and a political strategy for Afghanistan. And this is something we're expecting the world to focus. There is no way in war, because after 20 years, we have seen, Ambassador Kelley, that there is war and it whips away everything. And then we start again, including our talented, educated, achieved part of our society. It takes away many lives. It takes away opportunities. It actually takes away our economy, everything. And we have to start again. And that is heartbreaking as an Afghan who have lived all my life in Afghanistan. It's only 3-4 months that I'm not there. It's heartbreaking to see that it's happening again and again. In my lifetime, more than 4 decades, it has happened actually 3-4 times that I have seen the total collapse of everything. So there is no solution in war. We have to really go for negotiation and political settlement. But the way it's happening now and the way I see it, the world is basically lacking a common strategy. The only thing I will just refer to a wonderful article written by a great woman who actually served in Afghanistan. Her name is Melissa. She recently published an article in Foreign Affairs saying the only thing that now the world has an agreement, and probably Russia and the US will look at each other's eyes, is about Afghanistan. So let's use that international consensus that Afghanistan may sooner or later fall in the hands of military extremism and pursue a meaningful political dialogue.
Thank you, Fawzia John. Yeah, Lisa, please go ahead. And if you could also just talk a little bit more about these Oslo talks. And I find it especially troubling that Norway is actually on the Security Council right now and taking this kind of approach that seems to be really just, letting the Taliban get away with everything and not putting any standards or guardrails or any kind of real strategy in place, just kind of let's sit down and talk with these guys and fly them to Oslo in a private jet kind of and see what happens. Let's put on a show kind of approach to this, which is just seems so crazy to me. Sorry, that's a technical diplomatic term. But Lisa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Ambassador Currie. There has to be a strategy. There has to be thought put into this. There has to be objectivity. And unfortunately, the way the U.S. negotiator handled talks over the last 3 years, Ambassador Khalilzad, there was not the emphasis on elections, on a process that brings the Afghan people into that process. And I think that was a mistake. The negotiations were very much tilted toward the Taliban and providing concessions to the Taliban. So it shouldn't be surprising that here we are, the hardliners are in ascendance. You've got Haqqani network leaders, people that are on our list or designated foreign terrorists in the cabinet positions. You have Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is the interior minister. You have a Haqqani leader in charge of higher education, which does not bode well for women and girls' educational opportunities. You have a Haqqani leader in charge of refugees, which is a disaster when you think about all the foreign terrorist fighters that are going to want to flood into Afghanistan as they perceive it being a safe haven for terrorists. So unfortunately, I think the way in which the U.S. negotiated the Doha deal has left us with the hardliners in ascendance, and it has left us so far from the idea of an election that there's going to have to be a lot of work. And I agree with Fawzia Koofi, the international community needs to work together. But guess what? The U.S. needs to work with like-minded partners. This is Europe, maybe India, other countries that value human rights, that value democracy. Russia and China are not going to help when it comes to protection of human rights and pushing for elections. So I think it's important for the US to work with the UK, to work with France on the UN Security Council. So, we don't have this sort of dilution of respect for human rights and democracy, which unfortunately, the UN Security Council resolution that was passed in December, there was a lot of frustration from countries, including France, that human rights was not as prominently covered in that resolution as it should have been. So I think it's enormously important the way we engage. Look, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be engagement. I'm not even saying that the Taliban traveling to Norway was a mistake, but it would be a mistake if they stifle criticism of what's happening to women and girls. They have to be very clear on the expectations of the international community. And I think that the one silver lining, at least that I could tell, is that there were civil society leaders, human rights defenders that did sit down at the table and made their case to the Taliban. At least that's what I think happened. So I think it's extremely important for the U.S. to work with like-minded partners who care about human rights and democracy and develop a plan for trying to influence the Taliban. And, as hard as that is, we need to try for the Afghan people. And again, I'll bring up working with Afghans that have left the country, that are like-minded with us, that want human rights and democracy. There's a lot of educated Afghans that have come to the United States, come to Europe, Turkey. We need to facilitate them working together, and U.S. policymakers working closely with them in order to push forward on these important issues.
Thank you, Lisa. And I just want to remind our audience that the floor is open for your questions. So please go ahead and send those in through the chat box. And we'll be excited to hear those. But in the meantime, I want to go back to Lisa and follow up a little bit on that. When you say work with our like-minded countries, and most people would think of, I'm going to pick on Norway here a little bit since they hosted these talks. Most people would think of Norway as a like-minded country, and especially, they are quite famous for their gender policy and for having a feminist foreign policy. But yet you do see them taking what to me looks a lot like the same approach that Zal Khalilzad took in terms of, let's see what we can give the Taliban in order and how we can what concessions we can give them in order to give humanitarian assistance or get access. And I do worry, having spent time on working on the Security Council, that what we don't want to do is get into a situation where we are negotiating access with essentially terrorists who don't really care about the welfare of their own people, as we have been in Syria and Yemen and in other contexts, where we end up giving a terrible government and terrible leaders who don't care about their own people control over the fate of those people and humanitarian access to them.
Yeah, I think it's early to comment on the Norwegian process. I just need to learn more about it. But I do agree, if they base their strategy on wishful thinking, then it's going to get us nowhere. I think that's one of the problems with the U.S. Doha process, is you have to look at facts on the ground. You have to look at what the Taliban's doing and their actions, and move forward on that basis. I think the Norwegians are well-intentioned. They traditionally have been involved in peace processes, so it's not surprising that they're trying to play that role. But again, it's how they do it, the sort of guardrails they set, the priorities that they have, which should be shaping the Taliban's behavior, and protecting the Afghan people, and like you said, driving eventually toward an electoral process, which may be far away, but we still have to look at how you bring the Afghan people into the process. There needs to be a contract between the governed and those who are governing. And unfortunately, we don't see that right now. It's a very unfortunate situation where you have Taliban leaders who have no idea what they're doing, frankly. They don't have experience, they don't have training. And, I think that you do still have Afghans who stayed back, who do know something about running a government. But the Taliban leadership needs to listen to those people and needs to respect all the progress that's been made over the last 20 years, which they have not been a part of. So yeah, it's a frustrating situation. I don't want to denigrate the Norwegian effort yet, because like I said, at least they brought forward civil society activists to sit down directly across from the Taliban and make their case, which I think is positive.
I agree. I think, though, Fawzia and I have one friend who refused to go, though, because she was so frustrated with the lack of those guardrails and the lack of the plan. I'm going to switch to a question that we have from our audience, from Eugenie, who is asking how more specifics about how frozen funds could be directed to Afghanistan for humanitarian aid, and who could have oversight of the transfers. And so I'm going to ask, actually, Matin Sahib
You're on mute,
from
Kelly.
their own, sorry, from their own experience working on the ground, how Fawzia and Matin would structure assistance in a way that does minimize the leakage and the diversion problems with the Taliban, and does ensure that to the maximum extent possible, it is getting into the hands of those who need it the most. Lisa mentioned the World Bank's Trust Fund, which I believe is now being directed to UNICEF and the World Food Program, at least part of that funding. And so you do have some UN agencies that are on the ground. Are they being effective? Are they facing diversion problems? The community development councils, is that an effective mechanism? What are, as Afghan leaders, what are your thoughts on how to do this most effectively? And starting with you, Fawzia.
Ambassador Kelley, it's a good question, but in the meantime, again, as I said before, for us to talk about humanitarian crisis and humanitarian aid, but not about development and economical prosperity of our country after 20 years, again, is heartbreaking, I would say. But the reality of the situation is that now we are facing a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. I think we just need to learn from history. 25 or 23 years back, when the situation was more or less the same, there were a lot of civil society, non-governmental organizations, and the UN that was basically playing the government's job. They were empowered to deliver to the people humanitarian crisis, humanitarian aid to tackle the poverty. I think we have to use the same approach, with a difference that we need to ensure that it actually is transparently distributed, and women are part of it. I know that the trust fund you and Lisa mentioned, the UNDP is actually also managing some part of it under a project called Abadi. I think we need to really make sure that, again, I think that the Taliban's that struggle to survive period is over, because the first tranche of money went to Afghanistan. The cash is being given to the central bank, so certainly it's actually benefiting them as well. So we were hoping that before the situation gets to where it is, the Taliban will commit certain things. They will commit to let girls go to school. They will commit women to resume their jobs in the offices. And we were hoping that the world will use certain leverages over Taliban, but it was actually the Taliban who used women and girls' education as a leverage over the world. And that's why they are now saying that they will let girls go to school in March. And then we heard that the US said we will pay for girls teachers' salary, which is a great step forward for ensuring girls go to school. But it's basically the Taliban who are using these levers over using the woman as a leverage over the world. So I think, as I said, I'm going to emphasize there are ways that we could deliver to the people. There has to be a transparent monitoring mechanism in place. The UN, I think it was one of these countries, East European countries, where I think it was Bosnia, where there was an independent civil servant monitoring mechanism in aid distribution. This is something, certain mechanisms should be put in place. Women should be part of that, because again, I mean, they are the breadwinners of the family. So for me, that survival part is over. Now the Taliban started enjoying the humanitarian and playing with humanitarian aid. But still, I believe that in light of the extreme poverty, and in light of the fact that the country, the flow of migrants to the region, to the to Europe, to US, because of poverty and because of other reasons like human rights violation and insecurity, will be even expedited, I think. So that's why I think we have to do something. But again, I would like to emphasize beyond humanitarian aid on a political dialogue.
Matin, do you have anything to add to Fawzia's thoughts on that?
A few points to be added. First, I think Taliban cannot have access to this money because they are illegitimate. This money belongs to a constitutional order. Unfortunately, they overthrew it. Second, some of this money are like reserve bank money, which support the Afghan currency. So it has its own law how to be used. Third, I agree with her, there should be a mechanism put in place. The good thing in past 20 years, a lot of new institutions have emerged in Afghanistan. We had shuras, councils, through National Solidarity Program and Citizen Charter, where the women are also involved in decision making. So more, I think this shuras has to be involved in humanitarian aid and development. More things comes, which is established practice in the villages, in the cities. Thank you.
Thank you both. So I'm going to take the questions that we have. We had, of course, we get a bunch of questions right here as we're coming to a close with our time. It's always the way. Asghar, I think that your question was essentially the same one that we just answered about Taliban diversion of assistance. And then, we have a question from Mickey for Lisa about envisioning the recommendations of working more closely with private entities on Afghan extractions. And Jeff has a question about the current lack of political will, given the lack of political will from the current administration, I'm assuming, what points of leverage do exist to pressure the administration, the State Department, USCIS, which is our immigration offices here, for greater engagement with evacuating and resettling our allies, a really important question that I also have. And then from Saad, we have the economic collapse and humanitarian crisis could lead to Afghanistan becoming a failed state, allowing terrorist groups to flourish and find a safe haven. What is the U.S. red line to get involved to prevent a terrorist attack on U.S. soil or against U.S. targets? So I believe that we've got 3 good questions there. So I'm going to invite our panel to kind of take your choice on answering any or all, but to do it pretty, succinctly. This is a big challenge. So this is the round robin portion of our panel. And I'm just going to start. I'll start with Lisa and we'll go next to Fawzia and then wrap up with Matin.
Great. I'm going to answer Mickey's question about how we encourage the U.S. government to work more closely with private organizations who are trying to extract Afghans. Look, this needs to be a top-down command. You need to get the signal from senior-most people at the White House, the president, vice president on down, that this is important. That's what's most necessary right now, is that we need to see that commitment from the top of the U.S. government that we will continue to help Afghans who are eligible for resettlement in the United States to get out, and then putting in place the authorities that are necessary to do that, and then incentivizing the State Department to work with those private organizations. Because I think what we found, and Ambassador Currie knows this much more than me because she worked this problem 24/7 in August and September. But private groups were very resourceful. Okay, they were able to find people. They were able to help them do their paperwork. But then when it came to getting them on a plane, getting them to a third country location, they had to rely on U.S. government, and the U.S. government was not helping with that part of the effort. The U.S. government was prioritizing American citizens, rightly so, but they could have been doing more, and they could be doing more now to continue to help Afghans get out. They can work with the private organizations who can identify the people. The private organizations can help the paperwork get done. But when it comes to a third country allowing the P1 or P2 applicant to stay in that country while his processing is going on, you have to have a U.S. official negotiate that with the foreign government. And also the assistance that is necessary for some of these people. They'll leave often with nothing but the clothes on their back. And the U.S. needs to negotiate agreements with these third countries to provide assistance for those people. And here I'll just, major shout out for Qatar. As Secretary of State Blinken has said, Qatar has done more than any other country to help with the evacuation effort, housing refugees in some of the facilities that are meant for the World Cup. Had the opportunity to visit those facilities, a lot of care and resources going into helping those Afghan refugees. And there's other countries, Macedonia, Albania, who have opened their doors. And so the U.S. needs to show its appreciation toward these countries and work together with them as we work through the remaining applicants that deserve to be considered for resettlement in the United States.
Thanks, Lisa. I would add the UAE on there, who is also hosting 10,000 people in the humanitarian city there in the Emirates. And I think that you're right. We can't, it's the first priority of the U.S. government to assist Americans, but we can't do that in a way that makes it harder to help our Afghan allies and at-risk allies. And that's basically what's been going on for the past 6 months. And we need to get creative and stop using the bureaucracy as an excuse for why things aren't getting done and start getting rid of those bureaucratic barriers instead of hiding behind them. But Fawzia, I'm going to, again, let you take your pick of the questions on the leverage on evacuation, or I think we kind of addressed that, or the prospects for state failure and terrorist safe haven.
Well, I would, try to highlight a little bit on the question that Saad mentioned about this is actually the same narrative the Taliban are using. Either you support us or we will, the government will fail, and it's going to pave the way for further growth of extreme networks. As Representative Mike mentioned in his speech, you cannot tackle one military group with another one. The more we actually focus on military and fighting one group with the other and support one group, the more it's going to, pave the way for insurgency, for killing, for further deterioration of security situation. So I think we need to stand. Our hope from international community is to stand by people of Afghanistan, to stand by women of Afghanistan. Ambassador Kelley, the only group that is going to defeat historically the military extremists now is the women of Afghanistan. They will do that with fearless struggle, stance, with their life. So I think we all have to learn and stand in solidarity with them and support the people of Afghanistan.
And thank you, Fawzia, for inspiring us with those words. And Matin, any thoughts from you on any of these issues? Feel free.
Thank you. I would a little bit focus on the question of terrorism and how, unfortunately, Afghanistan is turning to another century of terrorism. The rule of Pakistan, the rule of ISIL, which is playing right now in Afghanistan, they're turning different region of Afghanistan, Kabul as headquarters of terrorism, a certain individual in charge, how to manage different terrorist organization, the relationship which they developed in past 20 years. So some of regional terrorist organization are really relocating inside Afghanistan. Some of the global terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda and others, they're also relocating inside Afghanistan. On the question of ISIS-K and using Talib as a counter-terrorism partner, I think it's a strategic mistake. This is what the Pakistanis are pushing, and that's their intention to legitimize Taliban. That will be the worst strategic mistake, to rely on Taliban as a city partner. As I know from the ground, some of those who are aligned with Al-Qaeda now are in charge of the crucial director of Taliban intelligence service in Kabul. So how could you trust terrorists to fight the terrorists? So my final comment would be, Afghanistan had come a long way. There had been investment, which, as Koofi Saib also mentioned, who could have believed that today the women of Afghanistan are marching or leading the civil resistance against the Taliban inside the country and outside the country. So we have now an educated younger generation. We have a vibrant civil society. We have media and everything. So I believe the US has to remain engaged. There are many ways they know how to do it. And the time is going fast against the Taliban. And honestly speaking, I have hope for the future to mobilize like-minded Afghans, work with our international partners to change the situation on the ground, which is possible. But the only concern I have is that the world should not rush to recognize Taliban. They have to pay a price for what they did, because they are the main responsible actors for today we are. They have to pay a price for that. They have to come to understanding they need the world, not on the other way around. The world needs them. As of now, why I'm not against engagement, but I'm against the engagement, the one happened in Oslo. Will send a wrong signal, and it might start the same thing what happened in Doha. Again, a competition among the European countries who will host the terrorists and put a red carpet. On the other hand, every day and night, they're arresting Afghan active women, youth, and killing the former ANSF inside the country. This has to stop. And a joint strategy is needed, and we have to wait. Time is going against them. They need to change. Otherwise, the statements cannot work. We have to measure their action. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matin. With that, I think that, all those interventions, I think we've had a really, really wonderful, rich discussion today. And I want to extend the CNAS's thanks to our guest panelists, Matin and Fawzia, who have been incredible leaders and will continue to be leading voices in the future of Afghanistan, and whose work, whose commitment, whose passion for their country and for bringing it into a better place is what gives me hope and inspires me to keep working for a better future for Afghanistan and working alongside leaders such as Matin and Fawzia Jan. But with that, I want to turn it over to my wonderful colleague and friend, Lisa Curtis, for any parting final words to close us out here on this really wonderful discussion. And again, thank you all for taking time to do this. And I'm sorry, I think we lost Fawzia there. I know she's in the UK, so it's a little bit late for her, but I will definitely send her a note later to say thank you. But I really appreciate CNAS also giving me this opportunity to continue to work on issues that are so close to my heart, and to have this opportunity to talk about these important policy issues. Lisa?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Currie, for leading this panel discussion so well, and for everything you did with the report. It wouldn't have been possible without your input and guidance. And just thank you for everything you're doing for the Afghan people and your continued efforts on evacuations and keeping a focus on the human rights situation. Thank you, Matin Bek. I thought you said it very well, your last remarks. And also Fawzia Koofi, we're just delighted she could join us. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.